I'm happy to be here. I love, this is a topic that I love to talk about, and I like to talk with other designers about. So with that, I'll just jump right into it. So the general topic of the day is how artificial intelligence is impacting design. But before I jump into that, I'm going to take just a little bit of time to unpack what I mean by artificial intelligence. It's a pretty broad term. So when I talk about artificial intelligence in the context of this talk, I'm really talking about machine learning, because this is the prevalent form of artificial intelligence today. And what is machine learning? Machine learning is a set of algorithms that can be used to analyze data, learn from the patterns that it detects in the data, and then make a prediction. So this prediction might be whether or not an email is spam or not spam. It might be whether or not a face belongs to a specific individual. The prediction might be whether or not the sentiment of a particular text, what is the sentiment behind the text that's being written based on an analysis of that data. We come across many other examples of machine learning in our daily lives. It's sort of an invisible force that's floating all around us all the time, and we're encountering it constantly. So examples might be the ETA of Uber or Lyft, might be a streaming series or a book that's been predicted for you. We might see it when you get the fraud detection alert in your email that says fraudulent behavior is suspected in your credit card, verify this purchase. We come across machine learning continually, so much so that I think it's like the water around us that we're not paying attention to anymore often. One way to think about the technology is that it's very different from traditional programming. So in traditional programming, we input commands, right? We write lines of code, and then we run that code. With machine learning, instead of code, we're inputting sample data. So for example, we have images of two different kinds of snakes, and we want to build an application that can differentiate between take a lot of images and put them into these two different categories. If we were doing that using traditional methods of code, we would have to write lots of lines of code to account for all the different variations that might occur in all the photographs or the images that might appear. It would be a very, very difficult task and very brittle, easy to break. If, in contrast, we are building a machine learning model to differentiate between images of these two types of snakes, we would give the model lots of labeled images of copperhead snakes, lots of labeled images of red rat snakes, and then we could ask the algorithms themselves, in a way, to learn to differentiate between the two snakes based on that labeled data. So you can see the difference in those two approaches. And then ultimately, we would have this really powerful application. We could spit any type of snake image into it, and it would differentiate those snakes into these two categories. Now, of course, we've only given it two categories, so it's going to put every kind of snake in those categories. It's even going to put pictures of you in one of those two categories, because those are the parameters that we've given it. So it's certainly not all powerful. All powerful. This is a very narrow kind of intelligence. Okay, why is machine learning growing increasingly prevalent in our society? Why is it popping up all over? Well, I talked about the importance of training data. Machine learning does not work without a lot of training data. You can't get a high accuracy rate without training data. We are generating tons of training data right now. We are generating tons of data in general. So if you think about your path to this lecture today, you may have checked your email. You may have opened your phone with your face. You may have interacted with a Siri or Alexa. You might have driven through a traffic camera. You might have entered a building with an ID. You might have made a purchase. You might have watched a streaming video. We are generating clouds and clouds and clouds of data around us. And this huge mass of data enables machine learning to work. In addition to the data, we need, and well, let me add one more thing about that mass of data. The data itself would not be useful if we couldn't collect it. So we also have the price of sensors and other input devices has dropped dramatically. So we have inexpensive ways to capture all that data. In addition to that, we need a way to process all that data. So machine learning would not be popular right now without the ability to process all of that data that's being produced. This is a number that just kind of blows my mind a little bit. And this is from 2018. As of 2018, the compute was 300,000 times larger than it was in 2012. So just think about that, 300,000 times larger than 2012. And by compute, I mean chip design, network architecture, cloud-based resources, all of the things that we need to process all of that data that we're producing. So these factors are come together in this kind of perfect machine learning storm. As the technology grows more pervasive, the cost will drop. And as the cost drops, it will become more pervasive. And this will have a huge impact, is having a huge impact on our society, and will continue to have a huge impact on our society. So a nice example of that kind of impact is the invention of electricity. So in the early 1800s, artificial light cost 400 times more than today. When artificial light began to pervade our society, our architecture changed. So we began to build interior spaces without windows. Our work-life balance changed. Suddenly we could work 24 hours, hello night shift, right? Our society was affected in very fundamental ways by the invention of this technology and the fact that it became very accessible to a large number of people. And we can also think of the internet like this. In the 1990s, the internet had a similar impact on our society, lowering the cost of distribution, communication, and search. Whole industries disappeared, new industries appeared, and certainly our society, our work habits, our social habits changed quite a bit. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with design? Why do we care? What does this matter? So first of all, I would suggest to you that machine learning needs us. The technology needs human-centered research methods. So as designers, we're trained to seek the desired future or the right thing to design. Data scientists, by contrast, are trained to seek what can accurately be determined from the data at hand. Both of these perspectives are very valuable, but we need them both. So imagine that a designer and a data scientist is throwing a dinner party. So a designer would approach that, well, now let's start with the data scientist. A data scientist would approach that dinner party by thinking, let's see, I need to come up with the optimal meal for this party. And what I'm going to do to come up with that optimal meal, I'm going to think about what ingredients are available, what's fresh, what's cheap, what's accessible, and work from ingredients toward the meal. The designer, in contrast, would say, hey, who's coming to my dinner? Do they have any allergies? What are their preferences? What have they enjoyed in the past? What kind of experience do I want to, what kind of connections do I want to foster through this meal that I'm making? And they would start there and then work back to their ingredients. In other words, if we need both these perspectives, so if we don't bring designers into the process of developing this technology, we're going to, in essence, end up with a lot of really optimal, well-functioning meals that nobody wants to eat and that perhaps are even harmful to us as humans. Okay, so the technology needs us. I would also say that we can design lots of interesting things with it. It's really quite powerful and quite intriguing. So one of the things that we can think about is using the technology to individuate, to customize information and experiences. So this is a project this is part of a really large project. This is a small piece of it, but this is a project that some of the Masters in Graphic Design students here did in collaboration with an auto parts company. So the auto parts company came to us and said, hey, we have this technology. We want to explore how it might ethically be integrated into our retail spaces in a way that directly benefits our customers. And this is one of the prototypes that came out of that project. This is a predictive maintenance app that customers and sales teams could explore together. And what it does is it takes your specific vehicle, make, model, vehicle history, and it not only indicates current maintenance needs, but it looks into the future and predicts maintenance needs that are likely to happen. And this idea is interesting because it's also being explored in the healthcare field right now. And this is predictive medicine. So predicting a health condition before the symptoms appear. Okay, so another example of thinking about creating these individualized experiences using the technology. So this is another project by a grad student here. This grad student was, Rachel Payne, was collaborating with colleagues in computer science to create an intelligent information hub. This specific project was for caretakers of kids with rare diseases. So from her research, she found that the first thing that a caretaker of a kid with a rare disease does when the kid is diagnosed is they Google the disease. And what happens when they do that is they are assaulted with all this information that they don't need to know at that phase of disease, such as end-of-life care. So the idea behind this intelligent hub is that when a caretaker comes to this site, it will give them only the information for the specific disease that they're dealing with in the specific phase that their child is experiencing. In a way, you can think of this kind of as old-fashioned hierarchy, like on steroids, right? But in a very individualized manner. So it's this idea of useful, usable, and desirable, to use Liz Sanders' terms, but in a specific context for a specific individual. This is a less admirable example of this kind of individualized interaction. So this is McDonald's intelligent digital menu that they're experimenting with. This is a menu that detects an individual and then prioritizes content depending on the individual's buying habits, their preferences, maybe even the time of day and local events. So the digital menu might say, hey, we know that you love bacon, egg, and cheese biscuits. So we're going to put it together right on the fly, a special combo deal just for you. And we're going to throw in some iced coffee because it's hot today. And we know you like to drink coffee in the afternoons. So making fast food even faster and more appealing, perhaps not a good thing for society. So if you think about these examples that I've given you, they're really examples of anticipatory design. So this is thinking about designing interactions, experiences in which the interface anticipates the human's needs and responds to them before they ask, right? There's no direct user input. Another example of this in action, this is another graduate project. from our master's students. This was a project in collaboration with IBM Watson Health. They came to us and said, hey, we have this technology and we really want to think about ways to use it to benefit deaf, hard of hearing individuals. So students did a lot of research and they zeroed in on individuals with cochlear implants, and they found that these individuals were often isolated from work lunches. So those lunches where you just go out with a colleague to some kind of restaurant near your workplace pre-pandemic and you have conversations. These conversations are really important because you talk about work issues, but you also really bond socially. These environments are really difficult because the noise levels are unpredictable. The number of people that you're talking to changes. In cochlear implants, there are microphones that can't just be changed on the fly depending on the environment. So this was a wearable that the students prototyped that would use Bluetooth to speak to the microphones and the cochlear implants. And the technology in the wearable would predict optimal microphone settings based on the noise level, the location, the individuals you're talking to, even the way that you're positioned in relation to the individuals around you. And what was interesting about this project is it's also really thinking about this human in the loop concept, which is that the interface makes a prediction, but the individual has a chance to respond to it in a really simple way, so that their feedback then continue to help to optimize this kind of anticipation of their needs through the implant. So you can also think of this anticipatory design idea as the difference between do it for me or do it for myself. So is whatever I want to do going to be automated? Is the system going to do it for me? Or am I just going to do it myself? Which do I prefer in that instance? Grammarly is an application that many of you may have used. Grammarly has a feature called autocomplete. And Google Docs does this too, not quite to this extent, but has an autocomplete feature. So it learns the way you tend to phrase things, and then it will make suggestions as you're typing for how your sentences might be completed using your writing style. So predicting what you're going to write and then putting it out for you. The idea is you'll be able to move faster through your composition. So doing it for me. This question of do it for me or do it myself is a pretty powerful question when you sit and think about it, because what comes from doing it for me is deskilling. So anytime I, as a designer, add a feature to an interface that does something for someone else, I am bringing up issues of deskilling. What skills am I taking away from them? And what skills should I take away from them? Or what skills would they prefer to instead build? So the classic example of this is GPS, right? Most GPS systems are built to replace our navigation skills. And as a result, our navigation skills suffer. But they could be built differently. They could be built to strengthen our navigation skills so that with or without the app, we have stronger skills. This is a question: how do we build skills using the technology to help us be more, to strengthen those skills outside of the device that Patty Meese often addresses with her group at MIT, the Fluid Interface Group. They've done a lot of projects, really interesting projects around this question. This is one of their projects. This is a device, and the idea of the device is while you're wearing the device, it is strengthening your human memory by combining very old memory palace memorization methods with AR. But the idea behind it is when you take the device off, your skill is still strong. So you're strong with or without it. One comment that she made to me that really stuck with me was that technology always fails, right? It's never always there. So when the technology is not there, who do we want to be? What skills do we want to have? It's also the difference between thinking about technology as scaffolding new skills or creating this kind of crutch that takes away existing abilities. Okay, so I've talked about this idea of anticipatory design and deskilling. Now I'm going to talk about how machine learning is changing the way humans relate to machines and how that affects what we design. So there are two technologies that are really key here, both powered by forms of machine learning. One is natural language processing and one is computer vision. And they are exactly what you would expect. Natural language processing is the ability of a computer to read, analyze text, and even generate text, and computer vision, similar thing with images. Both of these technologies are allowing us to communicate and interact with a computer in much more intuitive ways, through voice, through gesture, through expression, emotion, movement. In this talk, though, I'm going to focus a lot on natural language processing. Computer vision, there's a lot to talk about too, but let's touch briefly on natural language processing. So theorist Sherry Turkle at MIT has a wonderful book called Reclaiming Conversation, where she really thinks about language and computers and interaction. And this is a quote from her: "Machines with voices have a particular power to make us feel understood. Language is powerful human language. We have evolved for thousands of years to expect that anyone who speaks with a human voice is a human. And it turns out that is a really difficult thing for us to overcome." Researchers Clifford, Nass, and Scott Brave did study after study in their book, Wired for Speech, exploring this idea and trying to understand if we do indeed bring biases and social baggage to a conversation with a machine that we would bring to a conversation with another human. And they found that even if the voice is very overtly synthetic, we still bring those same biases to the conversation. It's very, very difficult for us to suppress those. This matters because humans are increasingly speaking to machines. So in 2019, Facebook's self-care chatbot, Wobot, was receiving 2 million conversations a week, and Amazon had sold 100 million Alexa devices. In 2020, hundreds of thousands of people were each sending around 70 messages daily to Replica. Replica is a personal AI companion that replicates your speech, attitudes, personality, and reflects them back to you in this companion. Microsoft Xiao's, a popular social chatbot, has over 660 million users, primarily in China. So a lot of people, and this is are speaking to machines right now. So one of the questions that comes up if we're designing these kinds of interactions, and I would suggest if you're thinking right now, well, I'm primarily a visual designer, I don't have to think about language and gesture, and I would put to you that it's going to become very difficult to separate those threads in coming years. Okay, so back to language-based interactions for a moment. Our natural attitudes toward, or proclivity toward language creates a lot of problems around these kinds of, they're very powerful and they have a lot of potential for very interesting problem solving, but there's also some problematic pieces to this, such as how might these relationships open us up to manipulation? And those exchanges that I just brought up, in whose interests are these conversations really happening? This is another grad project. This is a quick study. This is a ironic virtual agent called Bebop. And this little virtual agent manipulates you emotionally to speak to it the way it wants you to speak to it. So if you don't use the language that it can understand most easily and respond to optimally, it hurts itself, or you hurt it. So if you speak to it in the wrong way, its arm might break or its eye might blacken, and eventually you can kill it. So it's just very overtly playing with these emotional manipulation of the human user. Another quote from Sherry Turkle: Even as we treat machines as if they were almost human, we develop habits that have us treating human beings as almost machines. So how do our attitudes toward other humans change our relationships to machines? But then how do our relationships to machines then change the way we treat other humans? The theorist Yuval Harari raises this question as well. What happens when your refrigerator is more attuned to your emotions than your partner is? Who are you going to prefer? So interesting questions coming to light right now. So you might be thinking, well, let's just stop the language thing. It's very problematic. There are all kinds of possibilities for manipulation and abuse there. Let's just not do it. But we can't not do it because language provides an amazing channel for us to collaborate with machines, to have conversations in which we move to interesting places or interesting ideas with machines. AI researcher Sabaro Kumbhampati suggests if we do not focus on creating machines with an adroit social emotional intelligence, we'll end up with computers that don't understand us and don't need us. We are social emotional creatures. If we really want to move forward with machines, then we need to have that kind of social emotional relationship with them. I don't know if anybody here remembers Clippy from 1997, Microsoft Office, very rough attempt at a kind of not intelligent, but this virtual avatar agent idea. Everybody hated Clippy, and they hated Clippy because Clippy was perpetually smug and peppy. And smug and peppy grows annoying over time. So building these kinds of social emotional relationships as designers is very tricky. It's not an easy thing to do. It's very easy to get it wrong. And when you get it wrong, it's super, super annoying. It's exhausting. This is a project by the design and technology studio Telart, working with Toyota's advanced design team. They were experimenting with autonomous vehicles. So what kind of social-emotional relationship can the design and experience of interacting with an autonomous vehicle, what can come out of that, right? What sorts of relationships will we have with our cars in future years? And how might that relationship differ, to go back to this idea of just individualization, like how is that experience individualized to a specific person, and how is that experience predicting your needs, responding to them? What skills is it automating? What skills is it leading to you or strengthening inside of you? And then how are you connecting through that relationship to move to a deeper, more advanced place where we're discovering things we could not discover without that relationship. So all of these things sort of coming together in the autonomous vehicle. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about how machine learning might change not just what we design, but how we design. This is something we all care about as designers. How is this going to change our creative process? How is this going to change the way we work? All right, one thing we might think about is how machine learning might change the way we interact with our tools. So I talked about how machine learning allows humans to interact, to communicate with machines in more intuitive ways, through voice, gesture, emotion, movement, all of that. Well, it will also allow us to create things more intuitively using those same mechanisms. So one thing we can think about is how we might use our voice to design things, how we might design using language. This is a platform created by Sharif Shamim. This is a really simple tool. It's not simple, but it's an interesting little tool. And the idea behind it is you tell the tool what you want, add a button, add a text box. And it doesn't just add those items to a prototype in a superficial way, but it adds those items and it builds the backend code simultaneously, so it's functional instantly. So beginning to think about, and we can think about other ways that we might in a more complex way, design with language, right? It might be more than make the sky blue. It could be add more white space, increase the tension. What kinds of ways might design principles or design methods be applied using language? And what will that mean to kind of codify those ideas with language? We might even get to a point in which the very idea of a tool, the way we design tool or design software, the way we think of it now, will grow irrelevant because the tools will feel more like pieces of ourselves, intuitive parts of ourselves that we're using to create. So how else will machine learning impact design practice? Let's unpack that a little more. So Patrick Hebron is the director of machine intelligence at Adobe. He thinks about this in terms of scaffolding complexity. He points out these tools might make it possible, and here he's really thinking, he's thinking about creative tools across the board, but also including tools like CAD that might not come to our minds immediately. These tools make it possible to conceive of systems that are too grand and too complex for any one individual to keep all of their big picture goals and specific details in mind simultaneously. So this idea that we can design things that are much bigger and more complex by collaborating with these systems. One example that he gives is the Florence Cathedral, which from conception to build took about 140 years. Much more recent building, the Burj Khalifa, 5 years. Much more complex, much faster build. So we can do more, right? And we can take on more complex problems. So another Hebron quote, machine intelligence will enable creatives to do more and think bigger. So something else that designers tend to think of when we talk about AI is an idea that's been around for a very long time. I mean, we can look back to the 1960s. It's been around longer, but let's go back to the 1960s. Carl Gerstner's book, Designing Programs. In this book, he's really thinking about how designing things might be broken down into parameters that a traditional computer might then be able to recombine to produce lots of variations. So an example, he loves the morphological box. This is using a morphological box to take all of the possible parameters of a logo, breaking them down into discrete variables. So a computer can then combine and recombine them in lots of different ways. And his idea is the designer can then flip through all of these many different versions and pick the ones that they like best to work on or to continue to develop. Well, we see this idea playing out in a much richer, more interesting way today through GAN systems. So generative adversarial networks. Generative GAN systems are two neural networks, which are let's say for our discussion, it's a type of machine learning. It's a very complex type. Two neural networks that compete with one another to increase the accuracy of their predictions. So what I want you to take away from that is simply that GANs are generative, that GAN systems can create new data instances that resemble the training data, but are different from the original training data. So there is a generative, creative piece here that's really powerful for designers to work with. There are several platforms out there that make this technology very accessible to designers. Artbreeder is one of them. There are several others. This is a project led by Anastasia Reyna at RISD. Her team was working with Hyundai. Is it Hyundai? Yes, Hyundai. They work with Hyundai on a research project. This is a piece of a much bigger project, but I love these. I just find these so visually gorgeous. These are images generated by a GAN system. They were generated from a data set of 2,000 images of multiple marine invertebrate zooplanktons. So the training data, right, the sample data were all these zooplanktons, and then the GAN system created new images that resemble those images in some way. They have features of some of those images, but these are all new images. What's really interesting here to me is that these are images that a designer without the GAN system would not necessarily sit down and create, right? These are new forms that are informed by the perspective of the AI system. And this idea of integrating a different perspective, a non-human perspective in your work, this might be the most powerful way that we could potentially change our design practice using the technology. Janelle Shane, a AI researcher who I really like and who wrote a wonderful book, if you're interested in this technology, called "You Look Like a Thing and I Love You." She also has a really nice TED Talk too. She advises us that working with AI is a lot less like working with another human and a lot more like working with some weird force of nature. So what does she mean by that? Well, here's an example that she gives. David Ha from Google Brain, he started a research project, and in this project, he wanted to create an AI, and then ask the AI to assemble a certain discrete number of robot parts into a robot that would allow it to move very quickly from point A to point B. He had a clear image of how the AI was probably going to do that. Well, what the AI did is it just took all the robot pieces and it stacked them one on top of another to make a huge tower, and then let the tower just fall so that one end of it touched point B. This was a really different way of solving that problem than David Ha had envisioned would come out of that. The AI brought a different perspective to the problem. Patrick Hebron, who I mentioned before, he urges us that if we want human thinking, we should probably go to humans for it, because there are a whole lot of humans out there. But if we want to integrate a different kind of thinking into our process, that's when AI can be useful. And that's an interesting question for us to think about. What can the AI bring to the project to enrich it? So instead of trying to create these fake humans that we can work with, let's work with real humans, and let's instead think about integrating AI systems in different ways into the process. Of course, this can be problematic too, because AI has no understanding of consequences, right? They have no common sense. They have no larger understanding of context. That's what humans bring to that understanding. So this is not a matter of turning everything over to the AI, right? This is a very complicated collaborative process that has to happen between the AI and the humans. I haven't even touched on, maybe I touched a tiny bit on manipulation, but I have not touched on all the problems around machine learning as well. All the critical issues around bias, privacy, manipulation, surveillance. That's a whole nother talk, and very all kinds of issues out there that also sorely need the attention of designers. Now, there are a lot of people working on this right now. Data scientists are actively working on this, social scientists, designers. Many people are involved in taking on this issue because it has such a huge impact, right? Bias that's built into a machine learning system around, for example, who gets a job or who doesn't get a job, who gets a loan or who doesn't get a loan, who gets out of jail, who stays in jail. These are issues that amplify societal bias to a huge scale, right? So we're talking about high impact problems. So as I said, I'm not going to go deep into these today because I'm almost out of time and this is a big topic, but I just want to point out that there are a lot of designers doing really great work in this area, and there's room for a lot of other work to be done. So Joy Buolamwini from MIT, who founded the Algorithmic Justice League to raise awareness of bias in facial recognition for specific genders and skin colors, skin tones. These the work that she did has had a huge impact on policies around facial recognition, both private companies and the government level. Other researchers as well, but you know, designers can have a lot of impact. Sarah Gold in the UK, her studio, If. Sarah Gold does a lot of work around thinking about ethical issues around collecting and using people's data and helping give people both understanding and agency when it comes to data and the way that data is being used for and against them. Her agency, in addition to all the work that they've done, one of the things that they provide that I think is really interesting is a library of interaction design patterns that help designers, teams creating interfaces think about these issues and how to empower users around data rights and the things that they're making. Data scientist Stephanie Yee and interactive designer Tony Chu created a visual introduction to design learning. There's two parts to this. The first part is this beautiful visualization, that interactive visualization that helps you move through how a machine learning model that's using a decision tree makes a prediction to help designers and other humans, other non-experts, understand how these kinds of decisions are being made. So using design to help with that understanding. Mimi Oniowa, creating, she also she's an artist and a data researcher, also done a lot of work in this domain that's really interesting. This is one that I particularly love, the Library of Missing Data Sets. This is an installation that draws our attention not just to the data that's being collected by these systems, but the data that is missing, right? The data that is not being collected, and how the missing data also reveals our hidden social biases and indifferences. Another project, this is another project that Mimi did, but this one in collaboration with Diana Nucera, also known as Mother Cyborg, working with the studio and also TOO. They created this really great compact zine, A Beginner's Guide to AI. And what they did with this zine is they went around to marginalized communities and they used this zine paired with workshops to help educate people around their digital rights. Their goal was to give people the knowledge and the agency to then contribute to a more equitable technological future. And this is, you can download this zine for free. You can also buy it if you prefer the. Okay, so to sum it all up, to end this talk, we can let machine learning prey on those that our society already victimizes, but we can also use the technology as a mechanism for equity and justice. There's a lot of potential there. We shouldn't trust a technology that has no true understanding of human consequences to take the lead. We need to take the lead here. We need to get involved. We need to open our eyes. We need to work to understand the capabilities and the dangers of the technology so we can be an active process with how this technology develops and affects our society. And finally, that don't let this technology intimidate you. Understanding a technology is all about giving people the mechanism to do so, right? Don't let it intimidate you, and don't let it intimidate other people. Be the person who's helping people understand and engage with the technology. Give them tools to be able to interrogate these kinds of decisions that are being made, to be able to dig in, understand what's actually happening so they can have some say over predictions. Okay, so I would urge you that your skills and vision as designers are sorely needed. And then, as Christina mentioned at the beginning, if this interests you, this topic, I do have a new book that that touches more in depth on a lot of the things that I talked about today.